Hello and welcome to At the 55, your home for OUA football. Me and Tom are back on the mics, continuing our journey through our preseason preview podcasts, going through our tiers. Today, we're looking at tier C, or the one that we are colloquially referring to as the step up or step off tier, where we are looking at three teams. We gave you that as a little Easter egg coming off of yesterday's podcast. The only tier with three teams where we are saying this year we want to see if you can step up to really start to compete with the four teams, if you're doing the math, keeping score at home, that we have as definitively on paper over the track record of the last few years better than you, or if those teams below you, those teams in the 50-50 club who are nipping at your heels, looking to make a mark this year, get in the playoffs, all that jazz, whether you're going to step off and have one of those teams step into the limelight. We're going to go through who all those teams are just one moment, but not before I say, Tom, how the heck are you doing, my friend?
Always doing well, my man. So excited to be talking about these. I think this pod and the last one that we just did are section of teams that have so much potential, but also a ton of risk depending on their state of play. So I'm really excited to dive into these three teams in particular.
Most certainly. The three teams in question are the two hailing from the Ottawa region, my Ottawa GGs and the Carleton Ravens, and our Guelph Griffins. Yes, those are the C tier teams, the ones we are saying need to either step up or step off, with some of those frisky teams nipping at the heels. Tom, you had so brilliantly come up with the idea of going through the Ottawa and Carleton breakdown and then looking at Guelph. Do you want to give a little bit of a insight before we dive into the team specifically? What sort of drove that thinking? We'll obviously talk about those ideas when we go through them, but these teams are obviously similar in the ways that we're seeing them however many days before the start of the season, but there's a bit of a distinction.
We've seen with these two Ottawa teams, like you said, there's a lot of similarities. There's losing a few key pieces in certain areas, a few key players, for the most part, returning a lot of their core here. But something that you and I have spoken about previously about Carleton in particular, and now Ottawa is looped into this as well. The reason for this step up or step off mentality is that so many times these teams have been in really close battles with some of the top echelon of the OUA in previous years. But despite how good you and I both thought that Ottawa team was last year, despite the flashes of greatness that we saw from that Carleton team last year, when you look at these schedules, the wins that they had, both of these squads in 23 did not beat a team with a winning record. That's the biggest highlight point that I could possibly say as to why they are in this tier, is that you're beating the teams that you should, sure, but if you want to get into where you want to go, where everybody wants to go, you got to start beating the teams that actually have a winning record.
And that holds true for Guelph as well. If we're looking at how they fared last year and the last 2 years, as far as not beating a team that, again, on paper, the prognosticators like us, looking at how we think you rank, beating a team that, or just looking at a team that at the end of the day won more than they lost. That Guelph wasn't in that territory either. Guelph, I think, is a little bit different in terms of that's not as much the angle we're going at. Obviously, it's a changing at the helm. Coach Soria taking over, as you were highlighting to me as a reminder, still doing being head coach and the offensive coordinator on this team. We'll get into all the details of why we're excited about that as a club where, again, they really have not had success in this recent decade. The Ryan Sheehan era really wasn't all that spectacular. And so it's really in that area where they have the potential, which we'll go through briefly, of a team that could make some noise. But it could also be a bit of I don't want to say a dud, because I think that the new head coach, young players, that there could be progress that doesn't necessarily mean, competing for Yates Cups. But we'll get into all that momentarily. We decide we'll start with the Ottawa teams first. Let's start with the Ottawa GGs. And as we did with the other two podcasts, we'll do a brief preview of what the last couple seasons looked like. 2021, the COVID shortened year, they go 3-3. They lose in the semis versus Queens after beating U of T on the road. They won the Panda that year. 2022, they go 6-2, lose in the semis again against Queens. That was, of course, the JP Simon-Kinda, James Peter dominant year, and another W in the Panda for them. Of course, that was also the year we really saw Ben Miracle really come into form as the quarterback for this team. And then last year, we see Miracle pull an Aaron Rodgers going down seemingly on the first drive, or it wasn't the first drive because he got a touchdown, was looking sharp in that game against Waterloo at home. They go through the Canjo, they let her land on Josh Jansen, but nonetheless, it ends up in a 4-4 season, a loss in the quarterfinals this time to Queens. This is going to be something we'll talk about both in this podcast when we talk about Queens, that these two teams have played each other a gajillion times in the last 3 years. Worth noting again, another win in the Panda. So in this decade, Ottawa holds Pedro at their whim, having retained him for all 3 seasons we've had thus far. As some possible roster changes. Now, this is where, frankly, as someone who's been a huge fan of this Ottawa GG team, what Coach Belfay has been doing, it's hard not to like what they've been putting together. This is where things get really scary. As far as some players that they're losing, which of course include last year's President's Trophy winner, Max Charbonneau, who's doing his thing with the Winnipeg Blue Bombers, game-winning at the 55, game-winning field goal kicking extraordinaire, and Campbell Fair doing his thing in the CFL as well, I think, with Calgary on their roster. Amilcar Polk, who did such an immaculate job, like his ability to work as JP Simon-Kinda's backup and then take the reins and really put on a hell of a year last year was outstanding. He's still in the Ottawa region, but wearing red and black these days. And Emmanuel Abogia-Gyan, who's one of my favorite defensive players over the last 4 or 5 years. Their Sam linebacker could play a little bit in the secondary more definitively. I don't think he's stuck in the CFL, but I think he's out. I would be very surprised to see him out. So obviously their bell cow running back last year, with all the injury they had at quarterback, was huge for them, that he was able to be consistent. Their all-world kicker, and then 2 of their starting linebackers, but to boot, a guy who, despite being injured for last year, one of our personal favorites, taking his talents to the Kitchener-Waterloo region. That is none other than Harnoor Dhaliwal, who is going to play for the Laurier Golden Hawks this year. A massive pickup for Elgersma and his boys there. But a loss for Ottawa nonetheless, even though he was injured last year. Let's start with some of those names. We obviously saw how well Ottawa was able to, as we highlighted, bounce back off of JP Simon-Kinda leaving the program with Polk stepping up. They lose James Peter, a guy that we thought could have, who knows, been a President's Trophy winner in 2022. Lo and behold, Max Charbonneau steps up and wins that darn trophy last year. Do they have, and they still have excellent talent on that defense, some really good guys on that offense. Can they pull the rabbit out of the hat again and be like, kind of doing the Western thing of like, yeah, we graduate, we send off top talent, but that's okay because we keep refreshing the coffers year after year?
I don't think that you can actively say no to this, because we had this exact same conversation last year being like, there's no way you replace James Peters. There's no way. And to his credit, I'm not saying that Max Charbonneau did, but damn, did he do a hell of a good job this last season. He was all over the field, making tackles, being an outstanding defensive player for them. But I can't foresee that happening a third time. Like, to have a generational, amazing defensive player, I can't see you doing that 3 years in a row, but they did it last year. There's a possibility. Like you said, there's a lot of really great talent on that defense. But with this team, I think the biggest questions here are on the offensive side. You know, you talked about it. The first game of the season, they go up against Waterloo. Ben Miracle's first drive, you and I are looking at each other like, damn, Ottawa looks pretty damn good. And for those of you who remember, last year we had Ottawa in a higher tier than we did here, really saying, you know what, with Miracle healthy, with the weapons that they have, I really think that this is the year that they're going to be pushing for things. That injury to Ben Miracle and that Waterloo game is why that game was so close to begin with. Ottawa seemed to lose all of their momentum on offense. You could tell that their entire game plan was going to really be centered around Ben Miracle from training camp. And then that hits. And then Ryan LeCandro just gets thrown in there. And then you start trying to find your identity throughout. And throughout all of that, Amilcar Polk is the guy that you say, you know what, we're going to lean on you. We're going to need you to really step up. And he does. He does his thing. He's an outstanding running back, an outstanding get for them. And then you see LeCandro kind of struggling. You see this and that. And then Josh Jansen gets the nod and he goes in there. And then you watch the game against Laurier. And Josh Jansen goes 20 for 27, 233 yards, 2 touchdowns, no picks. And you and I are looking like, holy crap, do they have another like legitimate quarterback here? And my question marks here, what I'm really looking at is there's a lot of big players that you're potentially missing. Who's going to step up?
Yeah, and like I think we made this joke when we did the exit meeting episode about this team in terms of, man, if there ever were an opportunity for teams to be able to trade players, like let's go over the quarterback room for these Ottawa GGs. We're assuming Ben Miracle's back and healthy. Josh Jansen looked pretty good. I'm assuming he's still there, right? And again, by the time this podcast comes out, maybe rosters will be out, but just give us the grace of recognizing we're recording this 4 or 5 days. I don't know exactly how many before it's coming out. We don't have rosters yet, but Josh Jansen, as you highlighted, looked outstanding. And as well, I'll just throw out quickly, younger than Miracle. So like this could be a situation where if things aren't looking too good for Miracle off the jump, or it might be one of those situations kind of like we talked about at U of T where Barnett was was younger than Kinsale. So it's like, if things aren't going well, maybe you go to the younger guy, but put that aside because you still have a guy in Ryan LeCandro where, as you said, he struggled. I still believe in the talent. The guy's like 6 foot forever, came from Queens. I believe he's from the Ottawa region. And then I'll even throw in the name of Matt Mahler, who they list on the roster as an athlete, which he certainly is. But for those who remember, he was competing with Ben Miracle back in like 2019 to win the starting spot at quarterback. So again, there's so many ways, and depending on how the season goes this coming year, we can come back to this moment and say like, oh, Miracle had all these guys pushing him to be great, and that's why he succeeded, or things fell apart because no one, we'll do that whole sports talk BS then. But again, there's talent there. What direction are they going to go in? Hard to say, but whomever it is there, we'll get to the defense, and there's still some weapons there despite the guys they've lost. This offense, I think we really have to look at as being surrounding a guy that you got to see up and close last year. None other than our guy, Nicolas Gendron, who was one of the guys I remember you calling me the moment you left the combine in Waterloo, being like, Gendron was looking nice. This is a year where I think we're kind of staking our claim right now. Not that he's like a hidden prospect or anything like that. No, saying Gendron is going to be, he's going to be a dude this year. This is going to be a year for him.
Most definitely. Obviously, if you get invited out to a regional combine for the CFL, you've got talent. That's not a hot take. That's just pure. That's the case. But the thing that I really loved about Gendron is that he doesn't have necessarily the breakaway speed. He's still a fast guy, but he doesn't have the necessarily breakaway speed. But his route running and his hands were chef's kiss fantastic. He really showed out, and there was a few times I'm standing on the sidelines with a few other guys there who are just kind of watching, and he makes a catch, and we're looking around at each other like, damn, that was pretty damn good. And you start realizing that, like, well, yes, that quarterback room is pretty good. You've got Josh Jansen, Ryan LeCandro, Ben Miracle. The dudes they're throwing to are pretty damn good as well. Maxim Melafont was there. He had that breakaway speed. He showed how damn fast he was, despite being a little bit on the smaller side compared to some of the other receivers there. I think So obviously when you're out there, the difference between the combine, we detailed this previously, is that you actually have padded practices within there. So you can do one-on-ones, you can do some skelly work, and that's kind of what these CFL scouts are really looking at as well. In those one-on-one sessions, I think Maxim Malafont did, if he had 10 reps, 9 of them were straight flies. And it was just throw the ball up, let him go and get after it. And I talked about this before. The quarterbacks that they brought there were not exactly very good at that regional combine, but he made the best out of it. He was able to track things down. He did a couple of diving catches. Like, he was really impressive. And so him and Gendron in particular, when they're there, obviously you can see them when they're on the field, when you're watching the GG's games. But for me in particular, watching them in those scenarios, once again, amongst other people who are also in these all-star kind of statuses, you go, yeah, you guys are pretty special. And like you said, I'm expecting a very big year from Mr. Gendron going into this
Yeah,
one.
definitely. And like, to round off the skill group for this club, you got, I guess, the third guy in that receiving room, a guy in Kerwin Geese who showed some good things.
Mm-hmm.
What I'll be interested to see, as we kind of highlighted them moving from Simonkinda to Polk, is who really is the go-to guy. Now, they had Suleiman Kamara, who was getting a few carries behind Polk last year. And they also, and he's a young guy. It'll be interesting to see what he does this year. And they list Charles Asselin as a running back, but I almost see Asselin more in the way that we look at Liam Talbot in
Yes.
Windsor, where, like, kind of a bit of a more of a slot back guy. He's the guy you're going to give, your jet sweeps to, just get him in space. I think he does returning for them as well, much like Talbot does, as well. But, on the whole, like, that's a good looking offense with some question marks, right? Like, being like, again, starting with the quarterback position. But as we've talked about, and again, going back to when we had Nate on here, and it makes all the sense in the world to anyone with just a little bit of sense, a football sense, when you have talent, the receiving core, as you highlighted, that they have with Gendron and Malafont, like, whomever wins that QB position is in a good spot. And they've had good offensive lines over the last few years. So I feel pretty good about that. Moving to the defensive side, we highlighted that, they're losing some of these key players, including Harnur transferring. But, seemingly this is like, this is an NCAA with transfer portals, but this is some of the most action I've ever seen or can remember in recent years, where Harnur is out, but they get an incoming transfer from a guy coming down the street in Denny Ferdinand. And if you're thinking I'm mistaking Kasim Ferdinand, all Canadian receiver, for Carleton, if you forgot, he actually has a brother that plays on the defensive side and returns some kicks for them as well. And Denny, I can't recall if we ever got to the bottom of what kept him out the last 2 years, was it? I think he had his rookie year in the COVID shortened year, looked awesome, especially returning kicks. And then I don't think we saw him. Brother of Kasim, and if you believe in Kasim, which I don't think you have to, it's not a question of belief. Kasim's got the talent. We'll talk about him and his boys soon. That should give you some indication of what Denny has coming in. There's obviously other names on this defense we should go over, and that defensive secondary, if you add Denny in, looks stellar. But on that point, do we know what? I think you had brought to my attention. Do we know much about Denny coming over? I mean, that feels like treasonous. He's leaving his brother at Carleton to go to the GGs. Like what happened at Thanksgiving dinner last year? You know what I mean? Like,
yeah, I don't know the specifics of it myself. I know that the two Ferdinand brothers are damn good and damn athletic, and that teams desperately wanted them. And I think Carleton was really relying on the fact that, hey, we're kind of set here. However, I see a scenario, and I want to preface this. I do not know if this is the case, but I just see a scenario where if Denny has been injured for the past couple of years and he hasn't been able to get back into it, if Carleton obviously is recruiting to make sure that they've got the best players on the field, if he sees a guy that's maybe a little bit younger than him and maybe they're at the same level, or maybe this guy at the bare minimum has a couple of years on him because he's been playing or he's been a part of that system, if Denny kind of sees the writing on the wall and says, you know what, I see a career path for me in this Ottawa GG team that really needs me, and I could be a real threat to them, especially now that Amilcar Polk is gone, I imagine exactly like you and I are saying, Charles Aslan is going to have a much more prominent role in that offense. Do you want somebody who's going to be so pivotal, potentially returning kicks along with being a slot, being a running back, and all of that stuff? I'd say probably not. So having an unbelievable athlete like Denny Ferdinand come in, play on the defensive side of things, but also have the ability to catch balls and be a real threat returning, I think that's a happy marriage for everybody there. And Denny gets his ability to be that real star player that he is, rather than trying to reprove himself on a Carleton team that has had to move on without him because he's been injured or he's been out bare minimum at the end of the day. Once again, I don't know any of that to be true. I
Yeah.
just foresee that being the most realistic scenario for both of these squads.
It makes sense because then as I mean we'll get to Carleton in a few minutes. I mean they certainly have immense talent in their defensive secondary as well. And assuming he's back, they got a guy in Ottman Brom who's a
Mm-hmm.
great return guy. He's
Mm-hmm.
amazing in open space with the ball in his hands. Um, and as you said, that's a great point. If Charles Aslan has taken on a bigger role in the offense, then Denny, can earn that spot as the key returner. But as far as the depth and the defensive secondary, and again, this defense, again, at the linebacking core especially, that's where they really need to fill some gaps. But
Mm-hmm.
like he's joining the likes of the brothers Cumberbatch and Eric and Patrick, Kevin Victome, like absolute like white on rice type corner as far
Mm-hmm.
as the way he can just track nearly any receiver in the league. Tolu Ahmed, who, if memory serves, I think came from U of T a year or two ago. I can't remember exactly. As far as, again, we're doing the game of looking at the roster last year and assuming there's no obvious news that came to bear over the summer of a
Mm-hmm.
guy leaving or anything like that. We're just using eligibility academic years to prognosticate if these guys are staying there. And then as well, Christopher Cyril and Eli Crookshank, who missed a good bit of time last year. So a ton of depth in that defensive secondary. And of course, now we're saying you're adding Denny Ferdinand, but you know, that's not where I have concerns, if you will. Obviously, we mentioned that the linebacking core, you're losing two amazing talents in Emmanuel Bogiagian and Max Charbonneau, but also I think it was our exit meeting interview we did with about Ottawa of saying that they really just haven't had a really good pass rush. A team that hasn't been able to get after the quarterback, and that's where I worry is that in that the front seven for this team having now lost their two starting linebackers. They got a guy in Kevin Anderson on the edge and Riley Hildebrand on the inside, another year veteran, another year of experience for those two veterans, and maybe that's gonna help them improve on that end. But this is really, we highlighted those question marks on the offense because there's a lot of moving parts. There's some new faces, but a lot of guys that we have that trust in. That front seven is where, yeah, there's a few guys there we know who haven't been out of this world players, but have been good players there, like we said, with Hildebrand and Anderson. But the question marks are as well is that there's if that front seven is able to hold up to some of the rushing attacks of the OUA has to offer and be able to put pressure on quarterbacks, there's going to be a name that we're not as familiar with who 3-4 weeks in the season we're going to be saying, oh, so and so is now that guy for Ottawa. That's sort of my read on it, where it's like I don't know who that guy in the front seven is who's going to be the guy to really help them in their rush defense and get after the quarterback.
Yeah, and I love the fact that you brought that up because you can see even in some of the stats that kind of tells that same story. We know that Ottawa defense is solid. They've got some really good players, especially in that defensive secondary. And yet, when you look at the stats in the regular season, Ottawa was second last for yards per game. And in my mind, yards per game directly comes back to the front seven that's there because we know the athletes that are in that defensive secondary. We know that they are damn good. But if you don't have a consistent pass rush, if you can't get to the quarterback without sending 5 or 6 guys for that extra bit of pressure, the quarterbacks in this league, we've talked about it, previously in other years, but like once again, Taylor Elgersma, Evan Hillock, Tristan Lefebvre, Tristan Aboud, Keegan Hall, like All of these guys that are out there, if you give them a clean pocket, will pick you apart, even if that takes, instead of your standard 3 seconds, 4 or 5 seconds, because the quality of defensive back is great with Ottawa. If you can't make them uncomfortable without sending extra pressure and potentially leaving your guys out on an island, it's just not going to go super well for you. Now, Ottawa had a very much a bend but don't break kind of defense where they weren't giving up a ton of points by any means. But that yardage, that's really where that kind of comes into play. Your front seven needs to be there. Max Charbonneau was outstanding in what he did, flying all over the field and making those tackles. But in a sense, he's almost trying to make up for the fact that like that D line there, you're not getting the best out of them, I don't think. And not to say that they're bad players by any means, but you don't have a guy there where you're like, okay, offensive line, this guy's a problem. We need to game plan here. We need to do something here. It's just without having somebody like that, without having a guy that can consistently get to the quarterback, or bare minimum, hey, that running back can no longer leak out clean. He has to come by and chip that defensive end. You have to start doing slide protection rather than just a straight up 50 front. Like those kind of things greatly affect what you have. And it's a testament, once again, the fact that Ottawa wasn't completely run up on. And I shouldn't say run up on because it's not like they're bad by any means, but the theme of this tier is time to step up. Somebody on that D line, somebody in that linebacking core, certainly in the linebacking core to replace Max Charbonneau, but on that D line has to step up and be that guy, to be that problem for the offensive lineman that, hey, this guy's going to eat up a double team constantly. And even if we don't have a guy that's like a James Peter or a Max Charbonneau behind us, if he's always clean, he's going to make those tackles. He's going to make those plays. I need to see some more from that Ottawa D line for them to really be successful.
Yeah, and as much as like I think we both are in lockstep of liking the pickup of Denny Ferdinand, who wouldn't?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if they were gonna get someone from Carleton, like Michael Lightbody would have been a great addition. Just throw him in the middle and be like exactly what you were saying. Eat up those double teams, let those linebackers and those athletes in the secondary run free. Let's look at their upcoming schedule, and this can kind of lead us into best case, worst case scenario. We'll go through that. So for Ottawa, they open up the season at home versus Western, and then they head on the road to York. September, they are on the road at Waterloo, home against Queens, and then on the road. And this is one of the hardest stretches of football any team has. Home against Queens, then on the road for Windsor, and then on the road for Laurier to wrap up October, only to then come home and play in the Panda to start off their October schedule, October 6th. Make sure you have that in your calendars. Get down to the Ottawa region. Then they end their season at home, taking on the U of T Blues. Best case scenario that we are putting out for this team is a 5-3 record. And when we look at that, you know, Western to start off the year, and I think we've talked about this in years past, if you're ever going to get Western's goat or goose, whatever the analogy is, early in the season is kind of where some teams have scared them before. But I mean, I don't think we're saying Western's taking that one. You got the game against York. Take care of business at Waterloo, a team that you should beat. It really comes down to this stretch of games against Queens, Windsor, and Laurier, because for all intents and purposes, best case scenario, we're saying, hey, win the Panda again, take care of business against Toronto. So if you're keeping track at home, that has them at 4-1. Then there's these 3 games against Queens at home, at Windsor, at Laurier. As we said, no two teams have played each other as much as Queens and Ottawa have in the last 3 years. And that includes the game in the final week of the regular season last year, which was, if memory serves, I think it was like torrential downpour. Queens picks up that game, that win at home, 12-8. The following week, also in Queens, they take out Ottawa 15-10. So we have that bit of familiarity to give us a sense of, okay, if Ottawa can steal a game, and apologies to my GGs for framing to steal a game, but again, we do think that Windsor, Queens, and Laurier, as of right now, have that edge on you. Could Queens be a team that you can take out at home? Who knows? Maybe. Also, Windsor is a team where, yeah, you're traveling across the province, but Ottawa and Windsor have given us some of the best games we've seen in the last 2 years. What can we make of that? And as you already highlighted, Josh Jansen put on a clinic at home against Laurier last year, almost upsetting one of the best teams in the nation. in the Laurier Golden Hawks. So I think we kind of worked it all out to say we don't see them beating Western week one. Could you steal one of those three games? Yeah, best case scenario, probably. Could they steal two or all three? That's where I think we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves. Tom, what do you make of that to add in as far as our best case scenario breakdown?
One of the biggest assets that Ottawa has going for it, for both Carleton and for these GGs, is having teams come to them. Driving. The closest team is Queens, and Kingston to Ottawa is still what, 2 hours, 2.5, something like that?
Give or take, yeah.
Maybe a little less than that, whatever. It's still over an hour and a half. And for anybody, any athlete that's been on a bus, crammed in there, driving up over an hour anywhere, you're tired, you're exhausted, you're uncomfortable. It's just you're trying to get to that game, trying to get into your mindset, but you're out of your regular routine. You're not at home anymore, which is the case for anybody, regardless of where you go on the road. But having that extra bit of travel is something that the GGs and the Ravens are always have with them. The only other team that has that as well is Windsor. And
Yeah.
traveling down to Windsor after coming off against a game against the Golden Gales, which even if you do win, will be a grueling matchup that will test you no matter what, to then have to go into the OUA's best, and I believe the nation's best statistically, defense, traveling down to Windsor to take them on and really try to get that going. That's just such a massive undertaking. Then to drive back and then to go back again to the Waterloo region to take on the second best team in the OUA last year in the Laurier Golden Hawks with their outstanding team, and then to come back and play against Panda and against Carleton. And it doesn't matter what the records are for both of these teams. Either team can win that game no matter what, as we've seen in previous years. That stretch, I think you and I have we have talked about it obviously, but I think that 4-game stretch is the hardest that we have seen in the entirety of the OUA schedule so far. For that Ottawa GG team to come through there and come through on the other side at even at the 5-3 would be an outstanding record and testament to them just based off of that. I think that with all of these factors in there, and especially with the question marks that we have at quarterback and on that defense for these GGs right now, it's gonna be a tough go. It's gonna be a tough go no matter what.
Yeah. On the flip side of that, the worst case, we're saying 3-5, where that, Western still gets your goose, and that 4-game stretch that you just highlighted goes 0-4 for you. Take care of business against the Toronto teams, and then take care of business on the road against Waterloo. And again, from what we saw last year, and we talked about Waterloo, this is again that step up or step off territory where, like, we're saying worst case 3-5. Hey, real worst, obviously worst case is always 0-8 or whatever. But is that Waterloo team saying, screw you, we almost beat you in your house last year, you're coming to our crib, we're gonna take you out, and now we're gonna, you know what I mean? So like 3-5, I think we're being realistic because this team does have so much talent. They have that institutional knowledge of how to win games, how to be competitive, Coach Belfay leading the charge and everything like that. So again, that's where I think they are a prime example of what we're talking about with this category. Step up or step off. The talent is there, and this schedule is an absolute monster. Shall we move to our other Ottawa region team, Mr. Tom Sterling?
The very last thing that I want to say about these
Yes.
GGs is that with a lot of the coaching staff that's out there, there's a lot of guys who have only been in the OUA or only been at U Sports. Maybe some people like Coach Potasic with some experience in the CFL, but for the most part, you're really in the OUA or in U Sports, just kind of in general. With that, the really great ones like Coach Marshall or Coach Falls or whatever else, you have your guys, you make this connection. I think university in particular is so much more about those connections themselves. Marcel Belfay, being a historic CFL coach, knows in going into this saying the best players will play and doesn't have a problem, cutting people or making tough decisions because he's done it. He's done it at a very high level. I wouldn't be surprised if Josh Jansen is the one starting here, coming out for these GGs, even with a healthy Ben Miracle, just based off of what we've seen, Josh Jansen really seemed to come into his own near the late end of the season, and clearly he was the third string quarterback because he came out after Ben Miracle and Ryan LeCandro went
Great
down.
point. Yeah.
So what happens to him when he gets first team reps with guys like Gendron and Melifont and all of the offensive weapons that they have there to really get settled into that offense? What happens if even if Ben Miracle and Josh Jansen are something similar and they're playing really well? Ben Miracle's been injured for the past couple of years. And so do you put all of your eggs in that basket once again and risk that he gets injured again just to have to go to Josh Jansen? Or do you go with the young guy and say, let's get you used to first team reps, let's get you used to these live bullets and have that experience so that maybe even if this isn't the year for you, the next year or the year after, you're really going to see that progression that happens there. I wouldn't go into this being like Ben Miracle's the guy, this is what's going to happen. I think there's a lot of factors in here that I wouldn't be surprised if you see some surprises on that offense come week 1 against Western.
And that's almost what makes that game so tough, because a game against Western is one where you kind of have to put your hands up and say, hey, look, if we get our you-know-what handed to us, we have to take it with a grain of salt. We're playing the three-time, the trifecta, the three-peat Yates Cup champs in the Western Mustangs. Take it with a grain of salt. But the longer you take to make that decision, like, again, the longer the season kind of hangs in the balance. Let's talk about those crosstown rivals, though, because this is a team that I want to remind everyone, and again, that they're still in this category here, step up or step off, where we were talking in their exit meeting when we got to interview Coach Grant of a team that we are excited has the pieces on the field, on the sideline, and has shown the growth and the steps where this could be that team. This could be that Windsor of a couple of years ago, the Laurier of a couple of years ago, being like, oh, they're there. They're not quite ready, but they're ready to now step up. Let's do the rewind. 2021, COVID shortened year, 2-4, lost in the Panda. 2022, 5-3, lost in the quarterfinals to Laurier, a game that our own Tom Sterling was calling along with Jack Moore. Lost in a Panda, though, that year as well. Last year, they go 4-4, lose in the quarters to Windsor, lose in the Panda as well. Though I will highlight that game against Windsor was both on the road and a game they only lost 14-11. So worth noting on that standpoint, and also worth noting, as we talked about a lot last year, at the end of last year, and brought it up with Coach Grant as well, that going from 5-3 to 4-4 on paper looks like a dip. When you actually see how this team did, despite the fact you highlighted in both those years, they didn't beat a team over 500. What they were showing was growth. When you watch this team, it's certainly growth. Tom, let me get you to jump in on that before we get into the rosters, because again, I think this is something where we really we're bullish on this team coming out of last year, and it's going to obviously pair with talking about the players on the field. But for a team that goes from 5-3 to 4-4, yet we're here saying no, this team is absolutely going in the right direction.
Yeah, and I think you could even see, once again, you start to get a little granular with how things go, sure, but when you look at that 22 season, the big upset that happens there is obviously that Toronto game in, I believe that was week 2 or week 3, where that's Kinsale Phillips coming out party. That's really when things start happening, and that's, wow, we're really looking at the Toronto team going like, wow. But you look at Carleton and you go, hey, that's not typical of a Ravens squad, or that what's going on with them. And then there's a big loss to Queens later on, 49-17. And even in Ottawa, in the Panda game, it's 37-7 in that game. And we're looking around going like, man, Carleton, like, you're beating the teams that you should be beating, but the teams that you're not, like, you're getting blown out here. When we look at last season and you start looking at things, that Laurier game, Ben Huckabone catches a catch with 51 seconds left to bring it within 5, and they're going for an onside kick, and they're trying to get the ball, and they're in that game with, once again, Laurier being one of the top echelon teams in the OUA. Directly afterwards, you go to Western and it's 31-21. By no means a blowout. You're in that game. You're fighting. Certainly Western has
Sorry, home against Western. Sorry,
home against Western. Yes, sorry.
sorry.
But you're in that game and you're really pushing Western to the brink here. And they're coming out with a couple of trick plays that I remember and all of those. Even in the losses in this year, the Panda game, you only lose by 2 points on a Hail Mary of a kick by Campbell Fair, like you had mentioned. And Queens, you're right in there, 35-16, a little bit lopsided, but still you're there. So while on paper, you're still in the same category that we had just talked about, you're not beating the teams with a winning record. Those games that you're losing are now much closer. And then even you look at the way that they ended the season, you win against Waterloo 31-30 and pull that out, and then play against Guelph and win that 29-27. How much does that help you in your own mentality as a player to say, in those tight games where things come right down to the wire, we can win those? And when
Yeah.
you have a team that has a mentality that we're never out of this and we can always come back from this or we can always find a way to win, that's incredibly dangerous to have. And so I really like the way that this Carleton Raven team ended the season and how, especially the regular season, how they ended that going into the playoffs. I think they're returning a bunch of guys, which we could obviously get into here, but the changes that we've seen and the improvements that we've seen, even if the records themselves might be similar, to see that team start to really be in those big games, not just losing them outright from the second or the first half kind of thing, but to be in these games and to be competing against the OUA's best. That's really what we mean when we're saying we're seeing Carleton really start to pick up.
And you know what? It's like they really do mimic kind of where Mac is at. Like even the way you're describing kind of some of those 50-50 games and then being in tight with some of the big dogs in the league. But so then to transition into like some of these key players in the roster changes, which again, there's some guys leaving that program for sure that are hard to fill. But I remember our commentary going into last year is that this is a young Carleton team. On the flip side, Max a bit older. I mean, they got a young guy in Keegan Hall and some other guys as well. But so we look at some of the roster changes. Our guy Josh Ferguson, I believe it was confirmed when we were talking with Coach Grant that he's done after an immaculate career there. We've already highlighted that Denny Ferdinand is transferring out, but again, he hasn't actually played in 2 years, so that's kind of a bit of a moot point. Obviously, if he returned to Carleton, that's a boon for them. And then you have two guys who we were talking a bit beforehand because, I didn't want to make another blunder like I did talking about, I forget who it was, Owen Hubert, I think, for Mac, and forgetting that he was playing in the CFL. But Patrick Lavoie, their stalwart second team OUA All-Star, I believe, left tackle, and then Ife Onyeka, who I believe both got drafted. I don't think either of them are currently on rosters. So those are the two biggest wild cards. If they get back one of the best pass rushers in the OUA, as well as one of the best stoppers of pass rushers in Lavoie, that's huge. I haven't seen anything about those two. I'm not online, so I'm hard pressed to be doing the investigative journalism that I know you and our brother Nate Hobbs used to do and looking through the camp photos. So those two guys are major question marks. But even putting those aside, right? We saw the ascension of Tristan Lefebvre taking over this program, and a lot of that I think we did credit to the fact that he got to work with Andreas Duick, former OUA All-Star Yates Cup champion from your McMaster Marauders. Duick is gone, but I think Lefebvre has established himself as a guy, as a top 3 quarterback in the OUA, arguably, with a slew of weapons around him. And we clearly saw, let me finish by saying this. I think the big question mark offensively is still a matter of, was their aerial attack last year a function of the fact that they didn't think they could run the ball effectively, or was their insistence on wanting to be a heavy passing team the reason that Josh Ferguson and Alex Gale really didn't get a heavy a heavy rushing load on the season. And that's what I think is really going to be interesting to uncover. But even if they stay as a pass heavy team, it's the same weapons returning for Lefebvre, with possibly even his best offensive lineman returning. So even if it stays skewed that way, that they're just going to air the ball out, there's a lot of reason to believe that this could be top 2-3 passing attack in the OUA this year.
Well, certainly. And even when you look at the offense from last year, you see the great offensive powerhouses in Laurier, in Western, really at the top, especially when it comes to the total offense. When you just look at passing, it's still the case. Number 3 on that list in passing yards is Carleton. And they really leaned on Lefebvre, and he really came out this past year of really showcasing that he is the starting guy. He is the dude to take this Carleton Raven team into the future here. But like you said, third in passing yards, they are, well, let me put it this way. York, McMaster, Toronto, and Carleton are the only 4 teams in the OUA last year that did not have 1,000 yards rushing. And I think that really goes back into, well, yes, Carleton certainly had a lot of difficulties running the ball just in general. I think there is more of an emphasis on Lefebvre, on this passing game, than there was to really try to establish the run effectively here. I mean, you look at that first game against Laurier here, Tristan Lefebvre goes 31 for 45. 45 passing attempts in week 1 of the season, 31 for 45, 310 yards, 1 touchdown, 1 pick. I think that this Carleton team, at least last year, and I wouldn't be surprised if leading into this year, especially with the departure of Josh Ferguson, really establishes themselves as, you know what, we're going to live and die by the pass. And with guys like Frederick Hatchie, Kasim Ferdinand, your second team, All-Canadian, and some of those other guys in that secondary, the offensive secondary, we can make sure that Lefebvre constantly has guys to be able to throw to. Ben Huckabum being one of them, obviously. But that's really where I think this Carleton team is going to live and die. And sorry, I should preface this. Obviously, you and I, both former offensive linemen, both very much partial to running the damn ball. I think if to really be able to compete at a high level here in the OUA, you need to have something to make sure that the defense is off their heels a little bit. If every single defense knows that your run game isn't a threat, everybody's pinning their ears back and coming for Lefebvre, and he's taking unnecessary hits, or maybe he's being pushed into scenarios he doesn't want to be in with triple coverage on some of his key guys, and now he has to either tuck it and run or force a pretty a risky throw at the bare minimum. So that's really what I foresaw this offense missing, is having something of an established run game, even if it's not, you're not expecting a 1,000-yard rusher alone like a Jared Kasari or anything along those lines, but having somebody that's consistent enough that if you hand off the ball, teams have to account for it. He's going to break an arm tackle through a defensive lineman, get into that secondary, pick up some yards, and just have something of a change up here. Lefebvre is fantastic. We obviously saw his production last year. You got to give him something of a run game to take that pressure off of him as well.
Yeah, definitely. And it looks like that's, again, until we see rosters of training camp in the upcoming season, our best guess is that's Alex Gale, who I don't have the numbers in front of me. Like, obviously they went into last year, Ferguson being that veteran guy. And that was one of the things that Coach Grant talked about, speaking so highly about Ferguson and the way he helped mentor young guys. And so regardless of how Ferguson's season went, you have to imagine like those conversations he has with a younger guy like Gale being effective. You mentioned some of those other guys. Obviously, it starts with Kasim Ferdinand, guys like Frederick Hatchie, Hunter Brown, Tristan Reddy. Like it is one of those situations where if they can establish that modicum of a run game to just keep teams honest, like that's where they're so effective, where you can't really be double, triple teaming any of these guys because they have these weapons. And we mentioned this talking about McMaster yesterday on the podcast, of how, again, just when you go back to 2019, Mac winning a Yates Cup, and with Potasic, he's got Corey Grant, he's got Todd Galloway. And then you look at where those two have branched off, and obviously for Coach Galloway, when you got the Dutch rifle and Taylor Elgersma, you're gonna throw the ball, you know, the weapons that he has. But even going back to, you know, when we were at Guelph, like he definitely wanted to pass the ball a lot. We ran the ball pretty good at Guelph too, though. But then Corey Grant as well, part of that offensive mind core at Mac, that 2019 Yates Cup team, and we're seeing again that just trying to do the chicken and the egg. Is it the run game being suffering, quote unquote, as a result of a team that's like, we pass the ball? That's our identity. The same way that, you know, Western for years and years is like, we pound the rock. Anything we get in the air is a product off of that. It wouldn't surprise me. And if maybe this year the thought is, well, we saw last year what we were able to do, that we're one of the top passing attacks. Now to be able to become a more well-rounded offense, commit to running the ball again. If Lavoie is back, that pays massive dividends. Let's flip to the other side of the ball. A guy whose name I haven't brought up yet, but it'll be the first I bring up on the defensive side of the ball, is one Louis Lavoie. One of the best corners in the OUA last year, who got drafted, I think, by Ottawa. I can't remember who picked him up, but he got drafted. I think last I saw, he is going to be back for them, as I see Tom doing his due diligence, trying to confirm or deny that, which, if that's true, huge return for them. As we said already, Ife Onyeka, uncertain about his coming back, but, you know, pair him with Onyeka as like another guy where if he's back for them, that's huge. But nonetheless, we already mentioned his name. You got a guy in Ottman Braun, Al James Agomoto, Zendru Oden, Alamine Shipalu, Chris Topin, Malik Yusuf, like, and we mentioned him talking about Ottawa, Michael Lightbody, as a not so light body defensive tackle who's eating up those double teams and letting your linebackers run free. You know, this is a fun defense. Like, this is a defense that's got athletes, that's going to get after the ball, and a lot of cohesiveness. That, yeah, again, if you lose Onyeka and if you lose Lavoie as well, that's huge. And that's going to be, those are shoes that, as we've talked about with the Ottawa and other teams, you don't really fill them, but you just hope that whoever comes in can establish their own identity, help support this team. You know, again, it's a well-rounded team, and that defense, I think, is going to be one that is going to, and we saw them last year already, give some teams some fits.
Yeah, I think so. And what I will say, wasn't able to confirm Lavoie. Onyeka is back.
Oh, holy smokes.
Onyeka is back. So that's massive for this Carleton Raven defense, having somebody like him. And when you look at the stats from last year,
oh my gosh,
33 and a half total tackles for Onyeka, 5.5 sacks, 11 and a half tackles for loss, 1 forced fumble, 1 fumble recovery. Now, obviously, the tackles for loss is a big one, but the numbers don't necessarily jump off the page at you. The thing that you have to remember with Onyeka is that he is so damn good that you have to game plan for him. And that's the thing that we were just talking about with the Ottawa GGs here, is because you have a guy like Onyeka, you're not just going into an empty set backfield going, yeah, we're just going to block everybody straight up. You have to chip that dude. You have to account for him. And he's good enough that, you know, offensive coordinators can look at that being like, you know what? Trying to throw the 40-yard bomb that's going to take us 3 or 4 seconds to really set up. Yeah, no, we're not going to do that against these guys because he's in the backfield. He's coming after us. Quick passes. He's changing up the game plan that offenses are going into here. So to have him back in that setting is massive for this Ravens defense for sure.
I will put any amount of money if anyone wants to take a bet that Onyeka leads the league in sacks for this coming year. We can talk about that a little more as we see the year come to fruition. But oh my Lord, that is amazing. Yeah, that's huge. Okay, so again, it comes down to Lavoie and Lavoie. If those two are back, and if those two are back, again, this is where we're saying this team that's been consistent, building, forming this identity on both sides of the ball. Coach Grant really forming that identity of this team, building that culture that, again, like, I'm getting chills just just thinking about the conversation we had with him and just what he's establishing there at Carleton. I remind you, we were saying this at the end of last year as well. This is a team to be reckoned with. Let's go into the schedule, though, to take a look at where the upside and possible downside or the best case, worst case could be for this club. When we look at their upcoming schedule for the 2024 season, they start on the road at Guelph, return home to take on Windsor. September, they're on the road at Western, followed by a game at U of T, then are home for Mac and York. And October ends with them playing the Panda game at TD Place and then at home versus the Laurier Golden Hawks. Our best case scenario for the Carleton Ravens, and Tom, I'll give you the honor if you want to break it down, is 6-2 for this coming year. 6-2, and which again is a 2-game jump from last year, 5-3 in 2022. 6-2 is where we see best case scenario. How did we get to that number?
When you're taking a look at this schedule and you're understanding where this Carleton Raven team has been and how they've kind of gone through things here, we're looking at this saying, if you're coming out and really performing the way that we think you are, that you have the capabilities to, at the bare minimum, you're taking that dub against Guelph at home. You're then at home to the Windsor Lancers, which, yes, Windsor, unbelievable last year, but 2 years ago, if everybody remembers, Carleton beat them at home. Statistically speaking here, Windsor has not done the best traveling up to Ottawa against either Ottawa or Carleton here. And having that game at home, I think, is massive. And I think they have a real capability to win that. At Western, Western's always going to give you headaches. And especially at Western, that's going to be the first loss of the season, even in the best case scenario. You take care of business against Toronto. You host Mac and York, and those are both wins. Panda game, like we said, those are always up in the air. Any team can win at any time, regardless of schedule. You come away with that one. And then to finish off the last game of the season against Laurier, you and I had a bit of a back and forth in here because it's a crazy thing to think of, but there's a very real possibility here where we see Carleton and Laurier last game of the season, and both teams are 6-1, with the one
Ottawa.
loss being in Ottawa.
Yeah.
With the only loss being that Western squad. There's a real possibility that happens. And if both teams are firing on all cylinders, we're still saying that Laurier comes away with that one. But there is also a scenario here where everybody goes through this process and Carleton is 6-1. Laurier comes out and maybe they're 7-0. And maybe there's a scenario here where Laurier already has first place locked up and they're good to go. And so does that game really mean a whole ton to them? Do they want to just rest their guys so that they got 2 weeks off with that additional week for the playoffs? Is there a possibility, if all things kind of lay down, that Carleton comes away at 7-1? It's crazy to think of, but we're still saying best case scenario for these guys is 6-2, going through all of those scenarios.
And worth noting as well, as you highlighted, both Ottawa teams, the GGs and the Ravens, get their bye week after Panda, which I think is a great job by the schedule makers because of the high emotions of that game. I mean, in some regards, maybe it's better to get your bye week after you travel to Windsor or something like that. But again, I think it makes sense to give them both that bye after that matchup there. Yeah, again, that could be huge. On the flip side, like, just thinking about who they play, and they don't play Queens this year, right? And that's a big one, right? But again, if you're following along at home, we've yet to reveal our top 2 tiers. But if you're just ticking off who we've talked about and who we haven't talked about yet, those teams and those tiers include the likes of Windsor, Laurier, and Western. So off the jump, from our standpoint, saying that those teams are still a tick ahead of where Carleton's at, and you say you lose all 3 of those, okay, that's 3 losses. They start off on the road at Guelph, and we're about to talk about Guelph in 2 shakes of a lamb's tail. We see them in similar territory. They played a tight game last year. Reasonable that you drop that one on the road. That's 4 losses. And then you look at, again, Panda being a game, as you highlighted, you're fighting tooth and nail with the crosstown rival. Could that be 5 losses right there and end up in a 3-5 season? And you know what? Though you and I are looking at the same document, and you took their best case scenario and said, but there's really even an even better best case scenario, or maybe it's 7-1. There's an even worst case scenario without diving into the 0-8 situation. where this team in week three, or pardon me, in week five, again, Mac's a team that's played them pretty close over the years. And if Mac is, again, this is where it's step up or step off. And if Mac's looking good, Carleton's faltering a little bit. When we get to September 21st, is it unrealistic that Mac, in again this nightmare situation for the Carleton Ravens, doesn't take them out? So we have it as our best case scenario 6-2, worst case 3-5, but on the fly we just also made the case for maybe 7-1, maybe 2-6. Nonetheless, this is a team that I am so excited for. Like, we have been talking about this club since the end of last season. If they're going to take that step, like, they have that smell of the way Windsor was looking. You know, you go back to that 22 season where, as you highlighted, Carleton beats Windsor in Ottawa. But that was still a year we came out being like, oh, snap, Windsor football, here we go. And they took that step last year and really showed some amazing things, top of the country type things at times. Can Carleton take that step up? Or with some of the talent we have around them, is it going to be another year where, golly, maybe they don't even make the playoffs? Tom, we're an hour into this and we still got a team left, and that team's the Guelph Griffins. So you know we're going to talk long on that. So I'll give you an opportunity for last thoughts on the Ravens and anything Ottawa football region related. Otherwise, I say we move to the Royal City.
Absolutely. You know, last things that I will say is, once again, we've had these conversations for a couple of years now talking about Carleton. It's time, Carleton. It's time. It's time to step up. It's time to roll your shoulders up and say, we are the team to really beat here. You're not going to be, you know, we're not going to just remain in this middle of the pack kind of setting where we're not winning against we're beating the teams where we should, but we're not winning the teams in those close games. It's time. You've taken a step from 2 years ago. Last year, you're still in that zone. It's time to step up fully. It's time to be a part of that. Let's go.
Hell yeah, brother. Let's take a trip to the Royal City to talk about our Guelph Griffins. Going back to the COVID shortened year 2021, they, along with like 5 other teams, I don't remember exactly how it broke down, but went 3-3. Weird year, both football and every other component of the world. But as we were talking about beforehand, that year also possibly contained the highlight of the Ryan Sheehan era, which was going on the road in the first round of the playoffs and beating Laurier. They then lose in London in the semifinals to the Mustangs. 2022, they go 1-7. How did that happen? Injuries. I know they're like, this is a team that's been like, has had the injury bug as bad as anyone, but 1-7, like, and then last year they go 3-5. They just missed the playoffs, getting knocked out by Waterloo at the end of the year, if memory serves, or by Carleton. Like, the Carleton Waterloo games at the end of the season really gave them fits. And yeah, so 2 years not making the playoffs. Coach Soria at the helm now. The man with the plan, also calling up the offense. I mean, if we're talking coaching staffs, though, I mean, there's no other reason that we are as excited about this team than for the return of defensive line coach Brian Clough and offensive line coach Michael McDonald. And, you know, not to belabor the point, because I want to talk about the future of this team and the positive things, but I think there's a very fair way, and I think I've been unfair to the previous administration, if you will, of that team at times, or harsh, but a fair reading of those two returning to the program, who were there at the height, the pinnacle, the apex of Guelph football in the last decade and a half. Them leaving the program and coming back, wanting to be part of this program, whatever led to that happening. I think there's a way you could read that without being too unfair of saying that speaks to some, whatever, you know, whether bad vibes, whatever you want to say, of things stepping up positively from that standpoint. What do you make of, like, this team probably has had more coaching changes than any other team, and frankly, we'll get into the rosters momentarily and changes there. It's not that big, like, as far as the on the field like moves. pretty minimal with this team. We'll get into that momentarily. It's all been on the sidelines for this club. What do you make of the changes this team has made from the head coach down in terms of who's calling plays and who's, designing, everything that goes into putting these players in positions to have success?
When you talk to the Griffin faithful here, especially guys who are around the program, other coaches, alumni, all of those things, the vibe that's immediately been changed since Mark Soria has taken over the head coaching role is night and day different. You can see people are talking about so much more optimism here. We, from our outstanding fans, the people who listen to the podcast and the people who are on social media, they let us know a lot of times about how they're feeling. We get a lot of DMs. We get a lot of people tweeting at us, commenting on things. We put out something of saying, yes, we love you very much. We put out something saying, what do you think about Coach Sheahan's end to the era here? And my goodness, did you have some things to say? They were not exactly real good either. So to see that kind of coaching staff change and to see the change in personnel and to immediately have so many people say, I'm excited about this. I'm looking forward to this. I want to see what Coach Soria can bring back is something that I'm just very excited about this Guelph Griffin program, because even as a McMaster alum, for those of you who remember, I did have a coaching stint in 2019 with that Ryan Shea era, and I was a part of that Griffin team and only want to see the best for these Guelph Griffins. I really do, because I have a connection with that program and some of the guys who are still there, and obviously our connection to Coach Mike McDonald. But even talking with Coach McDonald at one of the regional combines here, and you say, one of the first things that Coach Soria did when he took over as head coach is he called Cluffer and he called Coach McDonald and said, guys, I need you back here. I want you to come back. I want you to be a part of this program again, because he immediately knew that these aren't just another coach, another guy who are here. Both of these guys are committed to the program. Coach McDonald might have played back in the day with the University of Waterloo, but his sons went to Guelph. Cluffer played at Guelph, wanted to be a part of this program again. Having that community who are just so excited about the program and wanting to come back and be a part of this. We had so many people reach out to us, say the Wildman dinner, the end of the year dinner that you guys always have. Alumni who hadn't been there in a couple of years are coming back to the program and who are excited about this again. So we're only hearing about the positive things that Coach Soria is already starting to bring to this program here. And quite frankly, you and I both we're done with the previous regime. We're on to the future here. It's why we have Guelph in the middle of the pack, certainly, whereas the previous few years we've had them in the bottom rung of the OUA. We really believe in the fact that where this program is going with the athletes that are on the field and the coaches that are there, I'm just much more optimistic about this Griffin program than I have been for the past few years.
And my goodness, if they did get Scott Brady from Mac, I'd have been buying my ticket to Kingston for the Vania already. Certainly getting ahead of myself on that. No, you're absolutely right. It's a vibe thing for sure, which, hey, like anyone who's been around any sport and especially football, like those things matter.
Mm-hmm.
If you can't, football's a war. And if you can't get your guys, your players to want to step up, that can be a challenge. Let's talk about those players on the field, because they certainly don't lack for talent in that realm. Let's start with some of the question marks. First and foremost, unless I completely misread it, they didn't have a single player. And again, we're doing the thing where we're looking at last year's roster. We don't have the updated roster. If you listen to this on the day that the podcast comes out, yes, there may be new rosters, yada, yada, yada. As of their 2023 roster, not a single player who was in their fifth year of eligibility, meaning that purely based on the number of years you are allowed to play as a starter, or however that works, they don't have anyone leaving the program as a result of that. Cool. Awesome. We love that. They did, of course, have the absolute standout defensive back, Devin Cromwell, transfer south of the border to, I believe, Texas Tech, was it?
Mm-hmm.
Go Red Raiders.
Texas Tech or Texas A&M. I can't remember off the top of my head, but it's a school in Texas, which is outstanding.
So cool. Shout out to Northern Secondary, where he comes from in Toronto. They had, of course, our guy in Curtis Woodmansey get drafted. He's back with the club. So that we know he's back there. As far as a few names that were fifth year academic, so, stands to reason that maybe they graduated, but shoot, like we certainly know plenty of guys who come back for 6th years, 7th years, even if they have the eligibility. But guys that were in their 5th year of school include the likes of Simon Shaves, linebacker. And I believe he long snapped for them too. And a wise man once said the ball doesn't magically appear in the holder's hand. So, don't undersell that. Defensive lineman, linebacker, Yusuf Al-Khalidi, which again, that's going to be huge for them, especially given how their rush defense struggled last year. To have him back. Josh Campbell, 5th-year academic, again, talking about that defense, but perhaps none more. No one I am more intrigued to see if he's back. First of all, like on the roster, and second of all, healthy to play, is one Scott Murray. Because again, when you look at the struggles that their defense had last year in stopping the run game, and then you think about how effective they were in slowing Queens down late in the season when Murray was back, I think it's fair, like the same way we were talking about a guy like Onyeka, when you have that type of force multiplier, whatever you want to call it, on your defensive line and your linebacking course, depending on how they set up their defense this year, that makes everyone else's jobs that much easier. And they have some other dogs on that defense. But let's stick with those names there. Guys like Simon Shaves, Josh Campbell, Yusuf Al-Khalidi, Scott Murray as some of the question marks. What is the impact? You're more familiar with some of these guys than I am. The impact of if they are there or if they are not.
Well, you could see a lot of the impact, especially from that defensive line with Yusuf Khalidi and with Scott Murray. When Scott Murray was out, and he didn't get a chance to play pretty much at all last season. Your main pass rushing threat being gone, especially your former All-Canadian from 2 years ago not
Christian
being
Stewart,
there.
yeah,
That's such a massive part of, oh wow, I'm not sure what's happening here or whatever else, but especially as an offense, now you don't have to deal with a Christian Stewart or a Scott Murray or any of those guys. And I'm not taking anything away from the likes of Josh Campbell, Curtis Woodmansey, or those guys, but to not have a registered, successful pass rusher disrupting players once again, it changes the way that people are throwing the ball. It changes the way that you come at everybody. Maybe Taylor Elgersma doesn't have 7 touchdowns in that beatdown that he did if there's a little bit more pressure into his face. Maybe there's other changes that happened last year if Scott Murray is able to really pin his ears back and try to get after people. Obviously, we're playing a what-ifs game, and that can get dangerous with whatever else. But having those guys back onto that program, back and healthy, is going to be massive. Now, what I will say is I am praying to whatever football gods are out there, just leave. The injury bug has been at Guelph. It's been there for a few years now. Let's get it the hell out of there. Ideally, just eliminate it all together, because I'd never want to see any player on this field or in this league at all get injured. Let's just take it away. Let's actually see what this Griffin team, fully healthy, can look like. Because when you look at the athletes that are on this team, and I'm just sticking with the defensive side right now, we just detailed Scott Murray, we just detailed Yusuf Al-Khalidi. When you look at guys like Josh Campbell, when you look at guys like Curtis Woodmansey, Brandon Farrigo, Anthony Martuzzo, which after the first game of the season against Toronto, I looked at you and I said, I think he's going to be the defensive player of the year. Unbelievable the things that he was doing just on that defensive side. And I think every guy that I just mentioned there had injury problems. Obviously, Scott Murray not being able to play. Anthony Martuzzo got injured after like the second game or something like that. Curtis Woodmansey and Josh Campbell have been dealing with injuries. They've been constantly going out and then trying to come back in. Just injury bug. Just stay away. Just stay away from these freaking Griffins. Let's see what they can actually produce if everybody stays healthy for all 8 games in the regular season.
Most definitely. And just to add a few of the names to the mix, we're sticking defensively. And yeah, Martuzzo, just a guy that's going to, I mean, yeah, as far as the injury bug goes, it can really raise the ceiling for this defense. But you still have guys like Braden McDougall in there, Anakin Guthrie, who also is a really strong returner for them as well on that defense. You mentioned Farrago, Javon Jacobson, who we didn't see in many reps, but for a young guy stepping into, I think he only played in like 2 or 3 games, but getting some of those reps, and the injury bug kind of got to him. A defense that, if some of those question mark guys that we were highlighting are back in the fold, yeah, can really help make this a defense that's one to be reckoned with. But another way to slow down an opposing team's rushing attack is if you're putting up big points.
Mhm.
And really, that's where I think this Guelph team, I mean, for years and years, going back to my time at Guelph and in the years following, like it was a team that hung its hat where it was like, we run the ball fairly well. We got quarterbacks and athletes we can get the ball out to as well, but defenses that are amongst the best in the league and great special teams, or I'll call them special forces. Shout out to you, Coach Billy Brown. Um, but offensively, do I want to start with the two seemingly incredible quarterbacks they have? Or do we want to start with, no, I want to talk about the running backs.
Yeah, hell
Donovan
yeah.
Malloy and the return, again, knocking on wood, injuries being fair or whatever, of Isaiah Smith. The idea, and with Coach McDonald returning and an O line that I think is returning most of their guys, and you know that line better than I do, under the tutelage of Coach McDonald, with Donovan Malloy and Isaiah Smith running the ball. We'll talk about Windsor in a podcast or two to come. Who knows? It is going to take a hit with at least George Una going to the CFL, and that's going to affect their run game. And their run game has been as good as any. We saw Western really try to stake their identity in the passing attack last year, and they certainly did. And Laurier, with as we mentioned, the Dutch rifle and all his weapons. They got Quentin Scott; he runs the ball really well, but they're pass first. Guelph is poised to be the best running attack in the OUA next year. Let's start with that, and then we can get to those guys they have hand the ball off and the threats that they can get the ball out wide. You know these guys a bit better than I do. Malloy and Smith, both out of the Golden Horseshoe region. Smith from Burlington, Malloy from Hamilton, right in your neck of the woods. And you know Coach McDonald as well as I do, and the guys on that offensive line. This running game, like, I am so excited. We talked about when we were talking about Carleton, former offensive lineman. Hey, sure, if teams want to pass the ball, that's great. More power to you. But this is a Guelph team that every retired offensive lineman, running back, H-back, tight end, fullback, and your mother and father should be tuned into week after week, because I think they will run the ball as well as anyone else.
I really don't see a scenario if everybody stays healthy, exactly like you said, where this team is not the number one rushing attack in the OUA. With all of the other outstanding rushers that are there, with a guy like Jared Kasari, who is coming back for the Golden Gales.
My bad, Kasari. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry, Queens. Yes, Jared Kasari. You are also spectacular.
Looking at that, you might say, you guys are crazy. How could you possibly think that? With all of these guys that are here right now, when you have an offensive line that looks like these guys do, three of the guys that got sent over to the regional combine, or sorry, the East-West Bowl were, well, two of the guys, Ethan Pyle and Daniel Hosevar, two guys from the offensive line who are studs in what they're able to do. I had the opportunity to go out and watch a couple of the OSFL games. I think that's the league that they're not calling it. That's the title of it. And I bumped into Coach Matt Berry, defensive coordinator now for the Guelph Griffins. And I looked over at him and I said, "Hey, how's everybody looking? How's everybody saying? Oh yeah, guys are getting healthy. We're getting geared up for training camp and all that." And I looked at him and I said, "How is Isaiah Smith? Because he's a Burlington Stampeder alum. He's my guy. I really want to see him do well." And Matt Berry turned to me and said, "Let me put it this way. If he doesn't want to play running back anymore, I'm going to put him at starting defensive end because he's that big and strong and powerful." Every single Guelph player that I've talked to about this kid is likening him to Saquon Barkley with just the size and strength that this guy is showing. His quads are massive. His running ability is fantastic. Even in that game against Toronto, I would still remember we watched him hurdle a guy, get hit in midair, and still land on his feet and keep going. I really think that he has the capabilities to be an outstanding running back. And then, oh, who's the other guy that they have? Donovan Malloy, who had a freaking coming out party last year and was really able to showcase how damn good he has the ability to be as well. With that two running back system there, along with a two quarterback system to keep people on their toes as well, I don't see a scenario where these Guelph Griffins are not at the top tier of that rushing attack, specifically because of the guys that I just listed.
And also one of those two quarterbacks rushed for 9 touchdowns last year. Let's
Yeah.
talk let's talk about the guys handing the ball off.
Mm-hmm.
We got two, like, again, this is one of those situations where we talk about, all the changes in the front office, if you will, or the coaching staff, I guess, to say it more specifically. Coach Soria taking over. Two young quarterbacks. You had two rookie quarterbacks come in last year. So at the end of the day, like, and we'll get to the best case, worst case scenario. Like, this team, I don't think has to. Like, I think this is a team that should make the playoffs absolutely this year. I think that would be disappointing if they didn't make the playoffs this year. I don't think they have to really do much more than give a competitive first round game because they are so young. And
Mm-hmm.
when you have a guy like Tristan Aboud, who very much looks like it's his starting spot to lose,
Mm-hmm.
but being spelled by Marshall McCray, cousin of the brothers Ford, who you can watch on your television now doing their thing in the CFL. Though of course Trey looks like he got a bit of a rib injury the other day. Hopefully he's doing all right with Edmonton. The athleticism he brings to the table, like, this is one of those situations where, like, there's a lot of pressure on Soria from the
Mm-hmm.
standpoint of, you have so much talent there. You have a great guy coaching up your offensive line in Coach McDonald, making sure these pieces, again, assuming they're healthy, are in the right place, and you're utilizing McCray and Aboud appropriately, and of course the guys that they're throwing the ball out to, going back to the injury bug, will hopefully, knocking on wood, include 8 games worth of Vishan Janusis, who at his healthiest is one of the best receivers in the league.
Mm-hmm.
Guy like Ryan Ogilvy as well. We were a little iffy about Kane Stevenson. I'm not too sure what his status is going to be. But again, this is a team that has so much potential. And, you look at those guys as young quarterbacks, when you can lean on a run game and lean on a veteran like Janusis and like Ogilvy to help, alleviate pressure from them with a good offensive line. It's the potential for this offense. Whether it happens this year, this is a team that's going in a beautiful direction right now.
There's a reason why you and I are so excited about this Griffin team, and we were really excited about them last year as well, even in the very early on, obviously before that Laurier game, and that kind of changed things for sure. But
And the Windsor
still,
game.
yeah, and the Windsor game wasn't great either, and all. But with a completely healthy team, with the direction of what the vibes, for lack of a better term, seem to be on that squad, with the new coaching staff that's there, and the direction of how things could go. If this team stays healthy, there is massive upside potential for Guelph to hopefully get back to being the Guelph Griffins of old that you and I are so accustomed to, where you're not just fighting for a playoff spot, you're in the contention for Yates Cups. I think there's a possibility here, if everybody stays healthy, that there's certainly, bare minimum, getting that home playoff spot and being able to kind of flex their muscles a little bit and say, yeah, we're back. We're still Guelph. This is how we do things.
Yeah. With that in mind, let's get into the best case, worst case. And, again, they kind of have the flip side of we talked about how Carleton ended the season on such a high note. This is a Guelph team that they had the future. They had their destiny was in their hands. They end their season. They blow a game late to Waterloo out on the road. They lose a game at home against Queens. Again, a game that, despite the loss, was a really good outing, a 24-17 final score. And then they lose that game on the road at Carleton, 29-27. That was disappointing, to say the least, but has all the stink of young team that's injured, and we don't know how to finish just yet. And maybe that means you should be in the 50-50 club. But again, I think for all the reasons we highlight, if this team is healthy, the vibes piece of it all, and just the return of Smith along with Malloy in that backfield, I think, is why we think they're ahead of that 50-50 component, that 50-50 club, if you will. Best case scenario, Tom, I'll give you the opportunity to spell it out for us that we have for this club looking at the schedule for the year is a very strong 6-2 on the year. Tom, how did we get to that?
When you look at the schedule coming up here, at home against Carleton, very real possibility you take care of business there. You come out 1-0. At Toronto, we think you get the win there, and then you travel to Laurier, and that's in our minds that's your first loss of the season. You host the at the 55 Bowl
Hell yeah.
against McMaster at home, and I think that's a very real possibility that you win that. You then travel to Queens, and in the past, especially with the old regime, there was a lot of bad blood in between the two programs. You know what happened with Coach Cheyenne and all of those things, but I think it's a very real possibility that Guelph goes in, takes care of business, and is possible to get the win in Kingston. You then come home against Waterloo, you take care of business there. You have Windsor come to you, and while yes, that is a bit of a drive, obviously to get there. Let's not forget 2 years ago the coming out party for Mr. Joey Zorn, and we saw Joey Zorn and Isaiah Smith really battling against each other, and what a treat that was. But Windsor coming away with the win, and that was Windsor's first plant in the ground saying, hey, we're here. We're a real force to be reckoned with. I think that's another scenario where Windsor comes into town, takes care of business, and is able to get things done, which is your second loss of the campaign. And then you finish off with a game against York that you take care of business on. And it is worth noting here that even if there's a scenario where Guelph goes in, maybe they are 6-2, maybe they go on to the lower side of things that you're just about to talk about yourself. What I do want to highlight is that Guelph has the last week bye.
Mm-hmm.
If they can get into the playoffs, especially if they can get into a playoff scenario where they host one, they get that bye week that every other team is so vying for. And to have that week off going into the playoffs and really setting things up, that's a great position to potentially be in.
Well, and you add on to that the fact that and again, I think I think as you said, we're talking best case scenario, Guelph's best case, and if they catch Queen slipping at home for whatever reason, could they take him out for sure? And I think you could say the same about Windsor, right? And I think that's where we come down to the 6-2 of like I don't think it's not unrealistic to say that could they steal, if we're going to still call it steal, one of those games against Queens or Windsor? Absolutely. And whichever way you break it down, I love you brought up the bye week. Hey, you know what? All the love in the world to the York Lions, but you host Windsor, you go to York, then you have that bye week. So again, yeah, maybe it's the Sean Law revenge game when you travel to the Lions Stadium on October 11th. Nonetheless, and I'm sure we'll then get into the conversation about rust versus rest and all those types of things when we get there in golly 2 months, just under 2 months time. That's crazy, by the way, to think that in 2 months time we're going to be heading into the playoffs. I don't want to think about that because we haven't even seen the first week. But Tom, you so eloquently, as you always do, broke down what the best case scenario is as we hold for them. The worst case, we're listing it as a 3-5 outing, and much like we talked about already in looking at Carleton, is it unrealistic that Carleton comes to your house on August 24th and takes a win? Definitely not unrealistic. They did it last year, albeit in Ottawa, but this is a team that beat you last year. Close game. We have you in the same tier, same ballpark. This is a huge game. Set the tone for the season. Show that, hey, we might be in the same neighborhood, but our house is looking a little nicer. Our yard's a little cleaner than you, Carleton. You got some stuff to fix up, right? Carleton, you're thinking the same thing. By the way, Tom and I will be live and direct from Alumni Stadium there on the 24th. Come say hello. We'll also be in Hamilton for the game after that as well. So, two opportunities to say nice things or not so nice things, however you feel about our little production here. But nonetheless, you lose to Carleton, pick up the win at U of T. Like, again, that's like we're hitting we're breaking glass in case of emergency if they lose that game regardless in week 2. Yeah, you lose to Laurier again. And then, you host Mac. This is where I think we went back and forth a little bit talking about Mac on yesterday's pod. And it's not unrealistic that Mac can beat them in the at the 55 Bowl, though we obviously have Guelph in a slightly better position. These two teams are, ultimately in a similar space right now. But so again, lose to Carleton, beat Toronto, lose to Laurier, lose to Mac, lose at Queens, beat Waterloo, lose at Windsor, beat York. So again, that 3-5, hard to picture. I mean, shoot, Waterloo, I guess, did get their, get them last year.
Mm-hmm.
But I think, that would, as we said, break glass in case of emergency if that U of T game goes astray. Certainly, I think this year that's the case for that Waterloo game. And again, just as a product of catching them in the last third of your season, the back half of the season, be the team this year that takes care of business. Hey, fellas, we have that last week bye. We don't take our foot off the gas until the whistle blows at the end of that York game, and then we can start to look ahead of things, right? Take care of business against Waterloo, see what you can do against Windsor. So to kind of recap, and certainly we can say a few more things about Guelph, not to move off them entirely, but with these three clubs, with the exception of Ottawa, where we kind of capped them a bit lower as best case at 5-3, and we gave you all your reasons for that. Rewind if you missed them. But 6-2 for Carleton and Guelph, Ottawa 5-3. Tom's out here saying Carleton's going to go 7-1 and win the Vanier. No, but then 3-5 is that floor. And then that's where, or for the worst case. And again, that's where when we look at this tier as being step up or step off, either of these clubs getting into that best case scenario, 6-2, 5-3 kind of range, or again, one of them really goes on a heater, you're competing absolutely for home field advantage in a playoff game. And that is a marked step up for these teams. If it's 3-5, that means that one of those Mac and Waterloo teams is probably taking you out in a game and might be kicking you out of the playoffs. And for all these teams, just like we said with Guelph, with how young they are at some key positions, especially offensively, a new head coach, you don't need to go on a Yates Cup this run. Is it possible? Yates Cup run this year? Is it possible? Absolutely. But make the playoffs. For Guelph, that I think will be a disappointment, and that's a disappointment, frankly, for all these teams, unless, of course, the truly worst things happen: injuries, asteroid from outer space strikes, whatever, to be extraordinarily hyperbolic. Again, just to kind of tie the bow on where we see these three teams being in that middle of the pack type of tier. Tom, any last thoughts on Guelph? I kind of moved off them a little bit, but before we kind of put a bow on this whole production for this episode.
Yeah, really just to help drive the point home of why we have them in this tier, why we labeled this tier that step up or step off. Guelph, it's time. It's time to get things going. It's time to have the caliber on the field match the result that comes out of this. How do you produce guys like Keandre Smith, Kean Schaefer-Baker, Clark Barnes, Coulter Woodmansey, all guys who are staples in the CFL, not just guys there, but they're staples in the CFL, and not have that consistently come back to where you need to be? The athletes that are on the field right now for Guelph are some of the best in the OUA. I really, truly believe that. It's time to stay healthy. It's time to put all this together. It's time to get back to where you should be. There's no reason for this Guelph team to have been struggling as much as they have been in the past couple of seasons in particular. It's time to get back. I know that we talked about injuries. I know that we talked about there's some things going on in the background, and there was a lot of people who had a lot of things to say about all of that stuff. That's over now. All of those excuses, all of those things, that's over. It's time to step up. It's time to get back to where Griffin football should be. Let's take care of business, and let's start winning some damn games.
Amen. And talking about getting into shape, Tom, you and I are certainly getting into season form, because we have crossed the hour 30 mark on this podcast without breaking a sweat. So I think that's a wrap for tier C. Again, step up or step off tier with Carleton, Ottawa, and Guelph. As I highlighted going into this episode, this is the only tier that has three teams, which means that the next two, the final tiers B and A, have two clubs apiece. And though we said we could see this Guelph team having the best rushing attack on the upcoming OUA season, the little sneak preview for tomorrow's Tier B pod is you're getting the breakdown of the best rushing attacks the OUA had to offer last year. You should probably be able to figure it out from that little hint there. So I'll leave it at that. Tom, you're a stud. It's a pleasure as always. And you can hear us talk about whoever those two teams are right here at the 55.